Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide, a reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that General Robert E. Lee wrote a farewell letter to his 28,000 exhausted and hungry soldiers just one day after surrendering his army to Union General Ulysses S. Grant? Learn that Lee's farewell message was carefully copied, signed, and given to his soldiers. Discover that General Grant pardoned Lee's men and allowed them to keep their guns, horses, and personal belongings so they could return home to their farms and begin spring planting. Learn that General Grant also gave them food supplies from the Union Army to feed General Lee's starving soldiers.
Imagine fighting a bitter, exhausting conflict for 4 years. I mean, you have given absolutely everything.
Listen, whole life just put on pause.
Exactly. But when it finally ends, instead of your opponent rubbing your nose in defeat, they hand you back your tools and offer you a meal.
It sounds almost impossible, especially after such a brutal war.
It really does.
Yeah.
But that is exactly what happened in April 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Thanks. I'm really excited to get into this one.
Today, we are looking at the actual text of General Orders No. 9 and firsthand historical accounts of the surrender. We want to understand how Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant engineered, basically a masterclass in forgiveness and moving forward.
Yeah, the mission today is really to see what this profound historical moment teaches you and me about the actual mechanics of reconciliation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even look at that famous farewell letter, we need to understand the dire reality on the ground that forced the surrender in the first place.
Right. What's fascinating here is how the reverberations of what happened in those few days, specifically between April 9th and April 10th, fundamentally shaped the trajectory of the nation.
Definitely. By April 9th, Lee surrendered his 28,000 remaining men to General Grant. And these troops had been pushed way, way past the limits of human endurance.
We are looking at a moment where the mathematical reality of war violently collided with the human necessity of peace.
The math of starvation had finally caught up to their strategy, right? We're not just talking about an army losing a tactical advantage here.
No, not at all. We are talking about the structural collapse of a fighting force. It wasn't a matter of willpower anymore.
It's sort of like a grueling marathon, or maybe a 15-round boxing match where the fighters are completely spent. One side simply lacks the mathematical reality to continue.
That's a perfect analogy. It was like the physics of a collapsing bridge. The load-bearing pillars of, supply lines, ammunition, and basic caloric intake had just vanished.
Wow, so morale alone couldn't fix it.
Exactly. You can have the most devoted soldiers in the world, but no amount of morale can hold up a bridge with zero physical supports. Lee was looking at 28,000 men who were physically decimated and literally starving.
And continuing the fight wouldn't just be strategically difficult, it would mean the total pointless annihilation of those men.
Right. So that sets the stage for the meeting at the Wilmer McLean home at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia.
And the commanders sit down, and this meeting lasts for 2.5 hours. Just 2.5 hours to effectively end the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history.
It's staggering to think about, just 2.5 hours in a living room.
But there is a psychological layer to this surrender that makes it so much heavier. General Lee was respected by his troops and his countrymen in a way that, very few military leaders have ever been.
Oh, absolutely. His reputation was towering.
Right. I mean, when Virginia seceded earlier in the war, President Abraham Lincoln actually offered Lee the command of the Union Army.
Which Lee rejected, yeah.
Exactly. His aura was so undeniable that there's this incredible detail in our sources about a girl in Pennsylvania. She's watching Lee ride toward Gettysburg.
And keep in mind, this is an enemy general invading her home state.
Yes. And she's overheard saying, "I wish you were ours." So I have to ask, how did that towering reputation make this inevitable surrender both harder and, more impactful?
Well, the emotional burden that comes with that level of almost mythic respect is staggering. When you are viewed as an infallible figure by your followers, admitting defeat carries a crushing psychological weight.
Because it isn't merely a strategic loss on a map, right?
Exactly. It feels like a profound personal failure to the thousands of men who trusted you with their lives. Recognizing a true no-choice scenario requires a very specific, rare kind of leadership.
Because ego often dictates that you go down swinging no matter the cost to your subordinates. The temptation must be to fight to the bitter, bloody end just to protect the legend.
Right. If he fights to the last man, he remains the tragic, undefeated hero who simply ran out of blood.
But by choosing to surrender, He absorbs the humiliation directly onto his own shoulders, so his starving men don't have to die for a mathematically impossible cause.
He took the hit to his own historical infallibility to save their lives. It was an agonizing moment, but it was the only humane choice left. Put the survival of the men above the continuation of a lost cause.
So Lee makes this agonizing choice to surrender. But the moment he does, a completely new, arguably harder crisis emerges. It's April 10th, the very next day.
Yeah, the logistics of communicating this to the troops.
Exactly. How do you look 28,000 men in the eye, men, who have starved and bled for you, and tell them it's over without breaking their spirits entirely?
That is the exact problem Lee faced, and it led to the creation of his famous farewell address, General Orders Number 9.
And the way this was created is actually quite poignant. He couldn't just, send a mass email or broadcast a message to the troops.
No, he dictated the order to his military secretary, Colonel Charles Marshall. They drafted it, edited it, and then it was written out carefully in ink.
And because there are no printing presses out there in the field, this has to be copied by hand multiple times. General Lee signed these copies and gave them to his senior officers to disseminate.
But the sources note something really moving here. Many of the enlisted men actually brought their handwritten copies directly back to General Lee, just so he could sign them.
Oh, wow. Picture the visceral reality of that scene. These exhausted, defeated men queuing up with scraps of paper to get a final signature from the commander they had followed through absolute hell.
They wanted a tangible piece of closure. They needed proof that their suffering meant something, directly validated by the man who led them into that suffering.
It speaks volumes about their devotion, but it also placed an immense pressure on the specific words Lee chose to put on that paper. Let's actually look at those words because they are incredibly precise.
They really are. He starts by acknowledging their 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude.
But then he writes that the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to push back on this phrasing a bit.
Okay, go for it.
When a defeated general explicitly blames the loss on overwhelming numbers and resources, isn't there a risk that he's just justifying the defeat to protect his own ego?
Like a, hey, they didn't outsmart us, we just ran out of bullets kind of defense.
Yeah, exactly. Or is he doing something more calculated for the men reading it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is almost entirely a calculated move for the men. Think about what these soldiers are returning to.
We're walking back to ruined farms, right?
Ruined farms, a completely shattered economy, and the immense social stigma of losing a brutal war. If Lee says we were beaten because we were outgeneraled and outfought, he strips them of their remaining dignity at the exact moment they need it most.
So it's almost like a psychological inoculation. He's injecting them with pride, so the shame of the post-war South doesn't completely destroy them when they get home.
Precisely. By validating their unsurpassed courage and placing the blame for the defeat squarely on a lack of resources and sheer numbers, he provides them with a psychological shield.
He's effectively saying, you did everything perfectly, your valor was flawless, the math just beat us.
Exactly. And he goes on to write that he consented to the surrender to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen.
He's explicitly telling them, I surrendered to save you. You didn't fail me. I chose to stop so you could live.
It's a masterclass in compassionate leadership during a crisis. And then he details the terms, telling them they can go home until exchanged.
Right. He urges them to take with them the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed.
Yeah.
And he ends with an affectionate farewell.
He is giving them permission to stop fighting, both physically and mentally. He meticulously framed the defeat so that they could return to their families not as broken failures, but as men who had fulfilled their duty against impossible odds.
It was exactly the narrative they needed to survive the brutal transition back to civilian life. But Lee maintaining his men's dignity is really only half of the Appomattox story.
Oh, absolutely. The other half is just as critical.
The success of this surrender hinges just as much on the incredible behavior of the victor. How General Ulysses S. Grant responded to his defeated enemy set the tone for the entire country moving forward.
Grant's actions are a profound study in the mechanics of grace. I mean, he had every military right to take these men as prisoners of war, to strip them of everything they owned.
And to parade them in defeat, which was the standard operating procedure for a vanquished rebellion.
Exactly. But he doesn't do any of that. First, he completely pardons Lee's men.
And then the specific terms of the surrender are astonishingly practical. He allows the Confederate soldiers to keep their guns, their horses, and their personal belongings.
And our sources explicitly state the reason why, so they could return to their farms and begin spring planting.
So what does this all mean? Like, why focus on the planting?
We have to pause on that detail because it's the key to understanding Grant's foresight. Grant understood the agrarian reality of the 1865 South. April is the crucial window for getting crops into the ground.
So if they miss that window,
If you confiscate a farmer's horse and his gun in April, you are essentially condemning his entire family to starvation the following winter.
the gun wasn't just a weapon of war anymore. It was a necessary tool for hunting and protecting livestock.
And the horse was the engine for the plow. Grant even went a step further, and the logistics of this are just mind-boggling.
He actually provided food from the Union Army's own supplies to feed Lee's starving soldiers.
Think about how difficult that is. The Union Army had been in pursuit. Their own supply lines were stretched thin.
To suddenly pivot your quartermasters to provision double the amount of men on a moment's notice requires a monumental effort. They were actively shooting at each other that morning, and by the afternoon, Grant is pulling logistical miracles to feed them from his own pantry.
Because Grant recognized that the moment the ink dried, the crisis fundamentally shifted. It wasn't a military problem anymore, it was a humanitarian one.
Right. You have 28,000 starving people standing in front of you.
The war is over. Now they're just starving people who live in your country.
There's an anecdote in our sources that perfectly captures this shift. After receiving the surrender, the Union Army naturally wants to celebrate.
Sure, they just won a 4-year, agonizing war.
Exactly. So Union Band starts getting ready to play a song in celebration, and Grant immediately forbids it. He stops the music before it can even start.
His quote here is so powerful. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again."
Wow. This raises an important question, doesn't it?
It does. Grant realized the profound difference between winning a war and winning the peace. Humiliating the Confederates, playing victory marches while they starved and wept, would only breed deep generational resentment.
You can force an army to surrender, but you cannot force a humiliated population to peacefully reintegrate. To put it in modern terms, imagine a hostile corporate takeover of a bitter rival company. You've fought for years for market share. The tactics have been nasty. It's been deeply personal.
Right, tensions are sky high.
But finally, you buy them out. Instead of firing everyone and celebrating their ruin, the winning CEO focuses entirely on the mechanism of integration.
That's a really great way to look at it.
The winning CEO makes sure the rival employees have rides home, keep their company vehicles, and get groceries for their families. It's prioritizing the functionality of the future company over the momentary thrill of the victory.
And it highlights actionable trust. Grant wasn't just ending a war. He was actively initiating the incredibly fragile process of rebuilding a fractured nation.
By trusting these former enemies with weapons and horses to take back to their communities, Grant was literally handing them the seeds to rebuild their lives.
Yes, he was welcoming them back into the fold of the nation, not through punitive oversight, but through immediate practical trust.
And that concept, welcoming someone back through actionable trust, is where the history bridges into something much more universal.
Because the interaction between Grant and Lee at Appomattox isn't just a fascinating historical footnote for military historians.
No, it serves as a profound blueprint for reconciliation that still applies to us today, to how we handle conflict.
Exactly. Our source material draws a very direct line between this historical event and deeper spiritual and philosophical frameworks.
Grant's actions at Appomattox were seen by many not just as sound military strategy, but as a profoundly moral victory. The text connects this specific type of grace to the example of the Savior forgiving sins and healing the sick.
Yeah, the source brings in a specific teaching from the Scriptures, Matthew 18.35, which discusses the absolute necessity of forgiving others so that you yourself may be forgiven.
The quote is, "So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not everyone his brother their trespasses."
Notice the phrasing there, from your hearts. It's a stark reminder that forgiveness isn't supposed to be a passive, begrudging tolerance of someone.
It has to be genuine.
Right. It is an active, fundamental requirement for communal and personal healing. The text uses this history to prompt us with some very challenging questions.
Like, how do we treat someone when they actually stop doing the wrong thing? And in what ways can you forgive and welcome a former friend into friendship?
Think about that in your own life. You listening right now are likely not ending a 4-year civil war.
Probably not, but you are almost certainly navigating some form of conflict. Maybe it's a falling out with a former friend.
Or maybe there's a family member you haven't spoken to in years over a bitter dispute.
Or maybe you're trying to rebuild a fractured relationship with a colleague. When that person finally stops doing the wrong thing, when the metaphorical surrender happens, what is your immediate next move?
True forgiveness requires the kind of actionable grace Grant demonstrated. It's not just saying, fine, I forgive you, and then holding their past mistakes over their head like a permanent bargaining chip.
Look at the mechanics of what Grant did. Stopping the celebration band, handing over his own army's food, letting them keep the horses.
These actions show that welcoming someone back requires you to voluntarily set aside your own right to gloat. You have to lay down your entirely justified desire for retribution and instead focus all your energy on mutual healing.
It's the difference between demanding an apology and offering a meal. Grant had every right, both militarily and morally, to demand groveling.
He had the power to make them suffer for the rebellion.
Instead, he looked at them and saw a countryman who needed to plant crops in a few weeks. He saw the human necessity past the conflict.
And we can't overlook Lee's role in this dynamic either. Lee had to accept that grace gracefully, which requires its own massive amount of humility.
Oh, absolutely.
He had to look at his men, validate their courage, but then firmly tell them to accept the terms, go home, and find satisfaction in their past duty rather than nursing the bitterness of the defeat.
Both men, in that crucial, high-stakes window of time, chose the specific path that would allow a shared future to exist.
The self-awareness required from both commanders in that moment is just staggering.
It really is. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, looking at how the end of a war teaches us the mechanics of peace.
We started by exploring the dire reality of April 1865, looking at the structural collapse of a starving army that forced Lee to the table.
We unpacked the immense emotional weight of the 2.5-hour meeting in the McLean home and the careful psychological shielding Lee provided his men by dictating and physically signing General Orders No. 9.
And we examined the logistical and moral miracle of Grant's surrender terms, stopping the victory music, provisioning 28,000 enemy troops from his own stretched supply lines,
and ensuring the men had their horses for the spring planting.
It is a moment that perfectly encapsulates the devastating consequences of human conflict, immediately followed by the very best application of human compassion and actionable grace.
It really, truly is. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder as you go about your week.
What's that?
Well, we've spent this time analyzing Lee's leadership and Grant's grace, the generals, the architects of history. But I want you to put yourself in the boots of the ordinary soldiers.
That's a very different perspective.
Imagine holding that signed piece of paper, General Orders No. 9, and walking out of that camp in Virginia. Because of Grant's incredibly practical terms and Lee's compassionate farewell, those exhausted men had to transition from soldier back to farmer in a single afternoon.
Wow. In just a few hours.
So here is the question for you. When a major defining chapter in your own life abruptly ends, when the battle you've been fighting for years is suddenly just over Aberdeen, how do you redefine who you are the very next morning?
That is something to really think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions and keep learning.
Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.